I'm Rebekah Higgit, Curator of the History of Science and Technology at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. I'm here at the observatory today in one of the object stores. This one is in the basement of Flamsteed House, beneath the apartments that the Astronomers Royal used for over 300 years. In these three short sections and vodcasts, I'm going to be talking about biographies of Newton that were published or written in the 18th century, some of them only being rediscovered and published in the 19th. The first section is going to be on the very first biography that was published, and indeed the most famous and the only standalone biography of Newton that existed in the 18th century. Before going on to describe it though, I think it's quite important to realise how famous Newton was in his lifetime. The fact that people were beginning to commemorate him, celebrate him and try and record things that he said even while he was still alive. For example, we have quite a number of portraits of Newton that were painted in the last decades of his life, when he was quite an important figure in the public world as Master of the Mint and President of the Royal Society. We also have a number of poetic celebrations of his life or of his works, and we have people who were close to him actually actively trying to encourage him to talk about his past, how his works were written and so on, and writing down those anecdotes for posterity. So we have different elements coming into the kind of biographies that were published of Newton. This is both the sort of official desire to commemorate a life and also the personal knowledge people had and a kind of curiosity that very quickly surrounded Newton. He was known for having produced very famous works, even if people didn't necessarily understand them. But people had the sense that his work had somehow kind of told the truth about nature, somehow kind of reached the mind of God or something. And we certainly have phrases that talk about Newton being sort of close to the gods and beyond mortal men, coming out in his epitaphs and so on. The first biography of Newton that was published was produced by an institution. It was an official commemoration, but it wasn't produced by the institution with which we probably most associate him, the Royal Society of London, but by its French equivalent, the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, of which Newton was a corresponding member. But obviously Newton was not perhaps as well known in France as he was, and certainly he wasn't as much celebrated in France as he was in Britain at this time. This biography was produced as one of the regular series of obituaries, or Eloge, that the Society's secretary, Fontenelle, wrote as a regular part of his job. Given the institution that was produced by, it's not surprising that the main focus of that biography was on Newton's scientific work. But it's quite ironic that this first real sort of important assessment, and a very good really and fair assessment of Newton's work, was being produced in France. We find particularly that Fontenelle was quite happy to compare and contrast Newton with his predecessors and also his contemporaries. We find, for example, him comparing Newton's scientific achievement and his ideas with Descartes. He sees them as being quite different, but also as being somehow sort of equal as well. This is something that for British readers of the biography was quite difficult to accept, but in the French context came out quite differently. Likewise, Fontenelle was prepared to give Leibniz, as co-discoverer of calculus, a lot more credit than British commentators like to do. However, for the more sort of personal side of the biography, Fontenelle actually relied on words produced by an Englishman, someone who did know Newton quite well, and was, as I was saying before, collecting reminiscences and anecdotes about Newton even while he was still alive. This was John Conduit, who was Newton's nephew-in-law. He was married to Newton's niece, Catherine Barton, later Catherine Conduit. And Conduit purposely brought together these reminiscences, put them together as a memoir and sent them to Fontenelle so that he could try and encourage him to include some of this information in his biography. Fontenelle very much picked and chose what he put in. Some of it wasn't suitable to the Eloge format. Some of it was stuff that Fontenelle probably didn't necessarily agree with. But he did include a certain amount of information about Newton's childhood, his education and so on, which is perhaps atypical for the format. So we find really straight from Conduit an account of Newton in his youth being very much more interested in mathematics and so on and in reading than he was in doing what his mother would have preferred him to do, which was learning how to run the estate. And because of this sort of clear bent that Newton had, his mother was persuaded to send him back to school and then to Cambridge. Despite those mentions of those sort of educational institutions, though, we find that there's this kind of image of Newton as almost an autodidact, certainly someone who's self-driven in terms of the reading, the mathematical reading that he does. So we have this kind of image of Newton as being a solitary thinker already coming through, and particularly a very youthful thinker and great genius, as both Conduit and Fontenelle make clear. And both of those two say essentially that Newton had laid the foundations of all his most important discoveries before he was even 24 years of age. The other thing that Fontenelle really took from Conduit was an assessment of Newton at the period that Conduit knew him, which is in his old age, once he was already very well known, very famous. Conduit was very keen to put forward all the ways that Newton was celebrated, all the honours he was given, the fact that he knew the royal family, all these kinds of things. And Fontenelle puts forward this information, though perhaps puts it in a slightly different context by saying, you know, almost isn't it quite strange that the English should have revered him quite to this extent. But again, taking from Conduit, his assessment of Newton's character suggests that none of this went to Newton's head, that he remained a very affable individual, he got on well with everyone, he was meek, gentle, mild, generous, all of these things come through, basically suiting very much the pattern of the sort of emulative biography that would have been typical for the period, and suited sort of the kind of classical and Renaissance models that biographers of the period were used to. So at this period we really have a combination of a sort of very idealised image of Newton with a sort of slight reassessment of his scientific work coming in from Fontenelle's side. But we'll find out in the next section that there were another sort of set of ideas about Newton, reminiscences about Newton that were somewhat contradictory to this. And biographies that were produced subsequently had to work with these sets of material and put them forward in a slightly different way.